Welcome to Mixed Magic Theater's We, They, and the People series. We, They, and the People is a Mixed Magic Theater civic engagement series that explores and dramatizes Supreme Court cases that have had a significant impact on the lives of all Americans, but especially its Black citizens. This project is supported by the XIX Shall Not Be Denied Why It Matters initiative of the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities, part of the nationwide Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation initiative, administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils and funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. This Theater at a Distance project is a donation-based streaming experience. All events are streamed on Mixed Magic Theater's YouTube channel. To subscribe to our YouTube channel and to support Mixed Magic Theater, please visit mmtri.org to make a donation. Thank you for your support, and as always, thank you for believing in magic.
My name is Yulie Lee. I am a second-generation Korean American immigrant. In the wake of all the horrific violence happening to Asian American AAPI people, we present to you the Supreme Court case of Korematsu versus United States, one of the key moments in history that demonstrates systemic oppression of Asian Americans. For decades, Asian American immigrants have been treated as alien. Asian Americans have long been considered as a threat to a nation that prompted a whites-only immigration policy. We were called a yellow peril, unclean and unfit for citizenship in America. But no social phenomenon happens in a void. What caused so many American people to migrate into the US? Colonization happening in all fronts. The French in Laos and Cambodia, the US in the Philippines, the British in India, Malaysia, Singapore, Qatar, and UAE, to name a few. And with this kind of imperialism rampant, none of the world's powerful countries used their powers to check each other. And to that, Japan during World War II, fighting against the Allies, quickly gained control over many of the colonies, like pawns in a chess game. Well into the 20th century, war-torn countries were no longer habitable, opportunities wrought. So the man looking to take care of the family chooses to leave his mother and motherland, find opportunities elsewhere, opportunities to come provide cheap labor and lay down the transcontinental railroads, a milestone that prompted economic flourishment in the United States. But something that doesn't make it into the convenient timeline of a Wikipedia page is a man's despair when losing his country and having to choose to leave. Everyone in South Korea learns about Dosan Anchang-ho. One of the biggest parks in Gangnam Seoul is named after him. He is studied as a freedom fighter who fought for Korea's independence. He died at the age of 59 of illness after being tortured by the Japanese soldiers. Only when I was an adult, I learned about his brief time in San Francisco. He worked on an orange orchard. He was an immigrant worker who worked in a suit and dress shoes, picking oranges. He believed that even picking oranges was bettering Korea's fate, and with the money he earned, he helped other Koreans settle into the city. He brought his family over to settle, yet he himself goes back to join his band of brothers to continue the fight. He never sees his family again, as he dies after being tortured. After his death, there was a letter that surfaced. His final words to his son in San Francisco was, in Korean, saying, "Continue your studies despite the horrible conditions." But what really punctures my heart is his final line in the letter. He writes, "Always keep smiling," in Korean alphabet. On is our history. He is one of our many prides. He himself, well aware of the discrimination that is happening to non-white immigrants, sends the message to his son to stay put and keep smiling. The atrocity of colonization isn't just another textbook fact in which its significance was that it brought about the great migration of Asians into this country. Its reality is people who were living noble lives suddenly having to search for safety and dignity. Yet again, the migration stories are banded into one paragraph in U.S. history because there isn't room to examine each person's story or to even try and fathom the complexities that happened worldwide as allies and axes played their hands in colonizing chess pawn after chess pawn. There's only room to other what is different, foreign, and threatening, and anything foreign and threatening, there is only one response: to repel and eliminate. In the late 19th century, white nativists spread xenophobic propaganda about Chinese uncleanliness in San Francisco. This fueled the passage of the infamous Chinese Exclusion Act, the first law in the United States that barred immigration solely based on race. Initially, the act placed a 10-year moratorium on all Chinese migration. Exclusion had a radical effect on the development of the United States' population of Asian descent. The banning of immigration from China led to increased immigration from other parts of Asia to replace the cheap labor Chinese workers had previously provided. Chinese women were specifically targeted. The Page Act, a Chinese Exclusion Act, restricted immigration starting March 3, 1875. The Page Act of 1875 was enacted prohibiting the recruitment of laborers from China, Japan, or any Oriental country who were not brought to the United States of their own will or who were brought for lewd and immoral purposes. The law explicitly bars the importation of women for the purposes of prostitution. The act, based on stereotypes and scapegoating, is enforced by invasive and humiliating interrogations at the Angel Island immigration station outside of San Francisco. It effectively blocks Chinese women from entering the country and stifles the ability of Chinese American men to start families in America. In the early 20th century, American officials in the Philippines, then a formal colony of the US, denigrated Filipinos for their supposedly unclean and uncivilized bodies. Colonial officers and doctors identified two enemies: Filipino insurgents against American rule and tropical disease festering in native bodies. By pointing to Filipinos' political and medical unruliness, these officials justified continued U.S. colonial rule in the islands. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 to incarcerate people under suspicion as enemies to inland internment camps. 2 months after the Pearl Harbor attack by Japan's military against the United States and U.S. entry into World War II, United States President Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which enabled his Secretary of War and military commanders to prescribe military areas in such places and of such extent as he or the appropriate military commander may determine, from which any or all persons may be excluded. Although the order mentioned no group in particular, it subsequently was applied to most of the Japanese American population on the West Coast. Soon thereafter, the Nisei, US-born sons and daughters of Japanese immigrants of Southern California's Terminal Island, were ordered to vacate their homes, leaving behind all but what they could carry. On March 18th, Roosevelt signed another executive order creating the War Relocation Authority, a civilian agency tasked with speeding the process of relocating Japanese Americans. A few days later, the first wave of evacuees arrived at Manzanar War Relocation Center, a collection of tar paper barracks in the California desert, and most spent the next 3 years there. On May 3rd, Exclusion Order number 34 was issued, under which 23-year-old Fred Korematsu and his family were to be relocated. Although his family followed the order, Korematsu failed to submit to relocation. He was arrested on May 30th and eventually taken to Tan Foran Relocation Center in San Bruno, south of San Francisco. He was convicted in a federal district court of having violated a military order and received a sentence of 5 years probation. He and his family were subsequently relocated to Topaz internment camp in Utah. Korematsu appealed the district court's decision to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, which upheld both the conviction and the exclusion order. The Supreme Court agreed to hear his appeal, and oral arguments were held on October 11, 1944. In its ruling, the court upheld Korematsu's conviction. Before chalking this up into an oversimplified moment of Asian oppression, we must acknowledge the complex nature of being Asian. When I was 12, I remember starting at a new school, and the only 2 Asian students in the grade was a Japanese boy whose name I no longer remember, and myself. In passing, he asked where I was from. I said, Korea. And he corrected me, no, Chosun. Then he called me Chosunjin, Chosun person. I thought little of this and went on with my merry day. Chosun dynasty is part of Korea's history. I just assume he meant that. At home, during dinner, I mentioned this to my father, sharing parts of my day, what I learned, what new game I played at recess, and he paused eating and asked me again. He was upset. Visibly angered, he told me that my classmate shouldn't be saying that. Tell him to never call you this again, and if he calls you Chosunjin again, you tell me. He then explained why this was actually an offense, called timeout. There's a pain that is associated with a Japanese person calling you a Chosun person, the language being remnants of colonization. And that was enough to make my blood boil. This boy was from then on dead to me. He was not my friend, no matter what affinity as the only Asians we shared. I grew up learning about the horrors of my people being colonized by the Japanese. Our last queen being murdered for refusing to being removed from her palace. So many women who could easily be my grandmother enslaved and raped. People used for labor and war. Historical monuments burned, but not just burned. Steel pegs hammered into every shrine to sever whatever spirit we had left. Erasure and murder on all levels. Even after finding our liberation and independence, no acknowledgement, no education, no apology, and definitely no reparations. But then talk to someone from Vietnam and the tables quickly turn. South Korea, allied with the United States, post-Korean Civil War, was involved in the many wars in Vietnam. Soldiers not yet recovered from our own war was sent into Vietnam and committed brutal massacres of civilian populations. Mix in the entire notion of disparities between East Asian and South Asian discrimination and Islamophobia post 9/11. Often within the Asian community, being Asian and Asian oppression isn't as simple as it may appear. There is a sense of pain when being seen as the same, a monolith, that is far beyond what is visible to the eye. Here are 2 truths that I hold truthful at the same time. 1. Korematsu's case, which discriminated Japanese American citizens, was systemically racist, deeming them permanently foreign in the United States, regardless of status. And this sentiment extends well into today's world. Asian American people are a type of American at best, hyphened in, never fully allowed to be American. Always asked, where are you from? And the follow-up to that is, go back to where you came from. 2, I find myself bargaining this horrid reality as a price paid for what the Japanese soldiers did to my country, my king and my queen, my ancestors. How can I not? Because when does unity end and accountability begin? So while I am angered by the systemically racist nature of Korematsu's case, to think of this Supreme Court case as a simple demonstration of Asian oppression is an oversimplified portrayal of the intricate nature filled with conflict that go well beyond the history of this nation. Nonetheless, in 2021 America, there is one box we're allowed to check: Asian. Perhaps on a particular day, we might have the option to check East Asian. But who has room for anything more? And when we're chunked under the name of Asian or East Asian or whatever group, we are seen as a monolith. And because of this, we're forced to shoulder the same xenophobic hate, being seen as yellow peril.
I think we got it. That was good. That was good.
I'm glad. Yes, I am.
All right, that's good.
Korematsu versus United States. Majority opinion by Justice Hugo L. Black. The petitioner, an American citizen of Japanese descent, was convicted in a federal district court for remaining in San Leandro, California, a military area contrary to Civilian Exclusion Order number 34, which directed that after May 9th, 1942, all persons of Japanese ancestry should be excluded from that area. No question was raised as to petitioner's loyalty to the United States. It should be noted, to begin with, that all legal restrictions which curtail the civil rights of a single racial group are immediately suspect. That is not to say that all such restrictions are unconstitutional. It is to say that courts must subject them to the most rigid scrutiny. Pressing public necessity may sometimes justify the existence of such restrictions. Racial antagonism never can. Exclusion Order number 34, which the petitioner knowingly and admittedly violated, was one of a number of military orders and proclamations, all of which were substantially based on Executive Order number 9066. That order, issued after we were at war with Japan, declared that the successful prosecution of the war requires every possible protection against espionage and against sabotage to the national defense material, national defense premises, and national defense utilities.
Dissenting opinion by Justice Frank Murphy. This exclusion of all persons of Japanese ancestry, both alien and non-alien, from the Pacific Coast area on a plea of military necessity, in the absence of martial law, ought not to be approved. Such exclusion goes over the very brink of constitutional power and falls into the ugly abyss of racism. In dealing with matters relating to the prosecution and progress of a war, we must accord great respect and consideration to the judgments of the military authorities, who are on the scene and who have full knowledge of the military facts. The scope of their discretion must, as a matter of necessity and common sense, be wide, and their judgments ought not to be overruled lightly by those whose training and duties ill-equip them to deal intelligently with matters so vital to the physical security of the nation. At the same time, however, it is essential that there be definite limits to military discretion, especially where martial law has not been declared. Individuals, must not be left impoverished of their constitutional rights on a plea of military necessity that has neither substance nor support. Thus, like other claims conflicting with the asserted constitutional rights of the individual, the military claim must subject itself to the judicial process of having its reasonableness determined and its conflicts with other interests reconciled. What are the allowable limits of military discretion, and whether or not they have been overstepped in a particular case are judicial questions.
One of the series of orders and proclamations, a curfew order subjected all persons of Japanese ancestry in the West Coast military areas to remain in their residences from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. As is the case with the exclusion order here, that prior curfew order was designed as a protection against espionage and against sabotage. In Kiyoshi Hirabayashi versus United States, we sustained a conviction obtained for violation of the curfew order. The Hirabayashi conviction and this one thus rest on the same 1942 Congressional Act and the same basic executive and military orders, all of which orders were aimed at the twin dangers of espionage and sabotage. The 1942 Act was attacked in the Hirabayashi case as an unconstitutional delegation of power. It was contended that the curfew order and other orders against none but citizens of Japanese ancestry amounted to a constitutionally prohibited discrimination solely on account of race. To these questions, we gave the serious consideration which their importance justified. We upheld the curfew order as an exercise of the power of the government to take steps necessary to prevent espionage and sabotage in an area threatened by Japanese attack.
In the light of the principles we announced in the Hirabayashi case, we are unable to conclude that it was beyond the war powers of Congress and the executive to exclude those of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast war area at the time they did. True, exclusion from the area in which one's home is located is a far greater deprivation than constant confinement to the home from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. Nothing short of the apprehension by the military authorities of the gravest imminent danger to the public safety can constitutionally justify either. But exclusion from a threatened area, no less than curfew, has a definite and close relationship to the prevention of espionage and sabotage. The judicial test of whether the government, on a plea of military necessity, can validly deprive an individual of any of his constitutional rights is whether the deprivation is reasonably related to a public danger that is so immediate, imminent, and impending as not to admit the delay and not to prevent the intervention of ordinary constitutional processes to alleviate the danger. Order number 34, banishing from a prescribed area of the Pacific Coast all persons of Japanese ancestry, both alien and non-alien, clearly does not meet that test. Being an obvious racial discrimination, the order deprives all those within its scope of the equal protection of the laws as guaranteed by the Fifth Amendment. It further deprives these individuals of their constitutional rights to live and work where they will, to establish a home where they choose, and to move about freely. In excommunicating them without benefit of hearings, this order also deprives them of all their constitutional rights to procedural due process. Yet, no reasonable relation to an immediate, imminent, and impending public danger is evident to support this racial restriction, which is one of the most sweeping and complete deprivations of constitutional rights in the history of this nation in the absence of martial law. It must be conceded that the military and naval situation in the spring of 1942 was such as to generate a very real fear of the invasion of the Pacific Coast, accompanied by fears of sabotage and espionage in that area. The military command was therefore justified in adopting all reasonable means necessary to combat these dangers. In adjudging the military action taken in light of the then apparent dangers, we must not erect too high or too meticulous standards. In support of this blanket condemnation of all persons of Japanese descent, however, no reliable evidence is cited to show that such individuals were generally disloyal or had generally so conducted themselves in this area as to constitute a special menace to defense installations or war industries, or had otherwise, by their behavior, furnished reasonable ground for their exclusion as a group. Here, as in the Hirabashi case, we cannot reject as unfounded the judgment of the military authorities and of Congress that there were disloyal members of that population whose number and strength could not be precisely and quickly ascertained. We cannot say that the war-making branches of the government did not have ground for believing that in a critical hour such persons could not readily be isolated and separately dealt with, and constituted a menace to the national defense and safety, which demanded that prompt and adequate measures be taken to guard against it.
Exclusion of those Japanese origin was deemed necessary because of the presence of an unascertained number of disloyal members of the group, most of whom we have no doubt were loyal to this country. It was because we could not reject the finding of the military authorities that it was impossible to bring about the immediate segregation of the disloyal from the loyal that we sustained the validity of the curfew order as applying to the whole group. In the instant case, temporary exclusion of the entire group was rested by the military on the same ground. The judgment that the exclusion of the whole group was for the same reason, a military imperative answers the contention that the exclusion was in the nature of group punishment based on antagonism to those of Japanese origin. That there were members of the group who retained loyalties to Japan has been confirmed by investigations made subsequent to the exclusion. Approximately 5,000 American citizens of Japanese ancestry refused to swear unqualified allegiance to the United States and to renounce allegiance to the Japanese emperor. And several thousand evacuees requested repatriation to Japan. We are not unmindful of the hardships opposed by it upon a large group of American citizens. But hardships are a part of war, and war is an aggregation of hardships. All citizens alike, both in and out of uniform, feel the impact of war in greater or lesser measure. Citizenship has its responsibilities as well as its privileges, and in time of war, the burden is always heavier. Compulsory exclusion of large groups of citizens from their homes, except under circumstances of direst emergency and peril, is inconsistent with our basic governmental institutions. But when under the conditions of modern warfare, the power to protect must be commensurate with the threatened danger. Justification for the exclusion is sought, instead, mainly upon questionable racial and sociological grounds, not ordinarily within the realm of expert military judgment, supplemented by certain semi-military conclusions drawn from an unwarranted use of circumstantial evidence. Individuals of Japanese ancestry are condemned because they are said to be a large, unassimilated, tightly knit racial group bound to an enemy nation by strong ties of race, culture, custom, and religion. They are claimed to be given to emperor-worshipping ceremonies and to dual citizenship. Japanese language schools and allegedly pro-Japanese organizations are cited as evidence of possible group disloyalty. It is said that we are dealing here with the same case of imprisonment of a citizen in a concentration camp solely because of his ancestry, without evidence or inquiry concerning his loyalty and good disposition towards the United States. Our task would be simpler, our duty clear, were this a case involving the imprisonment of a loyal citizen in a concentration camp because of racial prejudice. Korematsu was not excluded from the military area of hostility to him or his race. he was excluded because we are at war with the Japanese Empire. And finally, there was evidence of disloyalty on the part of some. The military authorities considered that the need for action was great and the time was short. We cannot, by availing ourselves of the calm perspective of hindsight, now say that at that time, these actions were unjustified.
The main reasons relied upon by those responsible for the forced evacuation, therefore, do not prove a reasonable relation between the group characteristics of Japanese Americans and the dangers of invasion, sabotage, and espionage. The reasons appear instead to be largely an accumulation of much of the misinformation, half-truths, and insinuations that for years have been directed against Japanese Americans by people with racial and economic prejudices. The same people who have been among the foremost advocates of the evacuation. A military judgment based upon such racial and sociological considerations is not entitled to the great weight ordinarily given the judgments based upon strictly military considerations. Especially is this so when every charge relative to race, religion, culture, geographical location, and legal and economic status has been substantially discredited by independent studies made by experts in these matters. No one denies, of course, that there were some disloyal persons of Japanese descent on the Pacific coast who did all in their power to aid their ancestral land. Similar disloyal activities have been engaged in by many persons of German, Italian, and even more pioneer stock in our country. But to infer that examples of individual disloyalty prove group disloyalty and justify discriminatory actions against the entire group is to deny that under our system of law, individual guilt is the sole basis for deprivation of rights. Moreover, this interference, which is at the very heart of the evacuation orders, has been used in support of the abhorrent and despicable treatment of minority groups by the dictatorial tyrannies which this nation is now pledged to destroy. To give a constitutional sanction to that interference in this case, however well-intentioned may have been the military command on the Pacific coast, is to adopt one of the cruelest rationales used by our enemies to destroy the dignity of the individual and to encourage and open the door to discriminatory actions against other minority groups in the passions of tomorrow. No adequate reason is given for the failure to treat these Japanese Americans on an individual basis by holding investigations and hearings to separate the loyal from the disloyal, as was done in the case of persons of German and Italian ancestry. I dissent, therefore, from this legalization of racism. Racial discrimination in any form and in any degree has no justifiable part whatever in our democratic way of life. All residents of this nation are kin in some way by blood and culture to a foreign land. Yet, they are primarily and necessarily a part of the new and distinct civilization of the United States. They must, accordingly, be treated at all times as the heirs of the American experiment and as entitled to all the rights and freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution.
Majority opinion by Justice Hugo L. Black.
Dissenting opinion by Justice Frank Murphy.
Wow. That was amazing. I was riveted. I was totally engaged.
One shot, Geoff.
Yeah.
Take Geoff.
Just because I got to move this along, but it's an added benefit. One and done.
One and done. That was great. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is our third and final episode of We, They, and the People, XIX, Why It Matters, hosted in conjunction with the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities and the Mellon Foundation. And as you saw earlier, we discussed the very significant case of Korematsu versus the United States. And our guest panelist for this event is the Honorable and Distinguished Allan Fung, a distinguished attorney in Rhode Island, former 4-term mayor of Cranston, Rhode Island, and one of the most prominent political figures in the state, and also as a 2-time gubernatorial candidate. Allan, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ricardo, for inviting me.
So this is always a difficult part of the program because we recognize at the very beginning that a person can't speak for everybody. Yeah. But we really do try to pose questions that give our guests an opportunity to respond to not only the case of Korematsu versus the United States, but also its impact, and not only immediately following the case, but also what's its contemporary impact? What's the impact that it may have today? So my first question is, do you think Korematsu versus the United States had an impact on the entire Asian American community, or was it limited to the Japanese American community?
Well, I think now that Korematsu case at that time, dealt with the internment of Japanese Americans. Right. But as an Asian society, for generations, we were subjected to, various forms of government-sanctioned discrimination. When you take a look at even as far back as the 1800s, within my heritage, the Chinese heritage, we were the first to be specifically excluded from the country with the passage of the Exclusion Act. And it wasn't until just after Korematsu, when we were in World War II, where that finally got lifted. But when you're talking about society as a whole, Asians in general, many of us over the course of time have felt various forms of discrimination and have had various laws passed against us as an entire culture, against an entire heritage. In fact, even phrases back then referring to us as the yellow menace really highlighted, and I think that Korematsu case, even though the Supreme Court went a different direction than what you're seeing, it has led to what is going on in today's society. And it's long been systemic and underlying from generation to generation and building back up. Because even in current day society, post-Korematsu, you had incidents within the Chinese and even amongst the Korean cultures, a lot of different things that have galvanized, solidified the community as a whole to speak out. Back in the 80s when I was growing up as a young boy, I remember back in Detroit hearing about the Vincent Chin, murder. And even as far, back in the 90s when you had the riots in LA impacting Koreatown.
That's right.
So it is something that has been going on and percolating for years now. That Korematsu case was just another nail that was hammered in against the Asian community.
So with that in mind, dealing with the idea that the Asian community is not a monolithic community, it is many different communities. I'm curious, do you think there are opportunities for these various groups now to form a more cooperative and united community, or knowing that each group has some history with other members of the group, is that still a far-fetched possibility?
I don't think it's a far-fetched possibility at all. And I think a lot of those groups are uniting now, especially with the violence that are going on against all Asians that you're seeing across the country, particularly many in the Chinese community. And I've heard from so many across the country, a lot of my friends that are living in New York City, California, that are really fearful. You know, my wife and I were just in New York, you know, last week, and even myself walking around, my head was a little bit on a swivel, just cautious of your surroundings. Hopefully, with what's going on, we are committed to uniting all the different groups together, because we have to stand together against something as, you know, powerful, to stand up against the violence that's going on. You know, this is not just mere words. This is unprovoked, disgusting attacks against another human being. And, you know, I've been involved now more recently with a lot of the national Asian groups. We're trying to get people together, being one voice, all on message, to ensure that, you know, we, in our respective communities, know there are resources and that we're all standing together, not in putting aside whatever type of, you know, cultural differences that may have permeated from past history. You know, because we are living not only in our country, but in our world as one now.
The Asian community internationally, the Pacific Rim, South Asia, the name of the country, it used to be Burma, Myanmar.
Myanmar, yeah.
Myanmar. Those are emerging, Vietnam, Cambodia, those are emerging cultures right now, emerging political forces, emerging economic forces right now. Do you think that emergence is hampering or has exacerbated the situation in this country, or is it an outlier?
No, I think what's going on is, when you take a look at history in general, it's each generation that, say for in America, coming to this country, you know, predominantly everyone, when they think Asian, they're thinking East Asian, Chinese, Japanese, right. But they forget Asian encompasses a lot more countries than just, you know, Japan and China.
Right.
You know, you have, like you noted, a lot of the Southeast Asians that are coming up now. You have Pacific Islanders that are part of that culture that a lot of times people forget about. You know, we right now are seeing that next migration of immigrants coming to America. And anytime, and you've seen this throughout, you know, the fabric of our country, whenever there's someone that's new that's coming in, that's different cultures, you have that fear. But, you know, the fortunate thing is, with each of the communities that have come, we're hopefully opening the doors, kicking down those bamboo ceilings that have permeated years ago, and trying to make the facilitation into our country a little bit easier. But with that, the fear always drives that you know, everyone to kind of retrench back sometimes. You know, we as a community have to stick together and make sure that door continues to stay open for the next generation of immigrants coming to our country.
Because it's particularly in this country, the opportunity for alliances is very often determined by, does everybody have a common objective? I regret to note that so much of the violence against Asians in this country has been perpetrated by African Americans and other people of color. How does one address that concern while addressing the concerns within the community at the same time? And what are the external forces that you think are driving that activity?
I think we have to continue building bridges amongst all communities. You know, right now the Asian community is coming together, uniting, but we're not alone. And I think that's what I'm so proud of seeing across the country, whether it's here in Rhode Island, New York, California, Texas, Florida. It's different communities, African American communities standing with us, Caucasians standing with us, because what is going on is just wrong. And the more opportunities that we have to unite all of our different cultures, coming together with that common goal, learning about each other and what we bring as a culture, as a heritage, and what we add to our country. The more that we learn about each other, the more that's how we're going to break down those barriers that we've seen from especially some of the violence that's happened.
COVID-19 and divisive and I think very destructive political rhetoric has seemed to expose things that many in the communities, in various communities, already knew. But now they're more exposed. The inequities, the imbalances, the injustices. I'm wondering, do we have an opportunity to look at these problems with fresh eyes and say, it doesn't just affect the African American community or the Asian community, it affects all communities. And part of my question is, are we dealing with the tip of the iceberg, or are we dealing with a bigger problem than we'd like to admit right now?
I think right now it is a bigger problem than what we're seeing just in the news, because I think as a society, we only have tended to focus on what's in the immediate, what kind of blows up. Because let's face it, with the news, that's what they like reporting. But, as we started this discussion, a lot of this has built up over time. And now with COVID, it really has, come to that crescendo where a lot of it is boiling over to the point where, words matter. And we saw that, you mentioned about, what's going on, politically. When you have the last president sitting out there, trying to make, one country, people from that country, even if they are Americans here, just like what happened in the Korematsu case.
Right.
He was an American.
Yes.
And trying to, make them out as not just bad guys, but something even beyond, to the point where those words not only just cut deep, but it incited people to action. And that's wrong. But now is the time where we have the opportunity to take advantage of bringing a lot of these communities together, all the different communities, not just Asian, but all the communities together, to have a serious dialogue about how we can move forward together to overcome some of these issues. Because this COVID crisis has shown that there are a lot of inequities.
Right.
A lot of inequities from communities of color, a lot of inequities based on income. And that's what we have to really, take a look at these issues and drive solutions to overcome a lot of these challenges in all the communities so that it's equal playing field for everyone.
So earlier on, we were talking a little bit about how this generation of Asians in America have a tendency to be more responsive and react to things more openly than previous generations. That the Asian communities had a tendency to be closed communities. They kept their thoughts, their feelings to themselves within the community. But that's not possible anymore. But it's just next generation getting this new generation getting a lot of pushback and resistance from the previous generation.
To some degree, but I think with what's going on with the anti-Asian violence, it's cutting across all lines and generations. Right. Because when you see an 80-year-old grandmother getting attacked on the street, I don't care, it's wrong. Yeah. And that sends a message through all generations, and it's time to speak up. Being first generation here, I'm proud of, being able to lend my voice on important issues at all levels, because we have to do that as a society to make a lot of our officials know what's going on in our backyards, in our communities. And we have to continue to do that. When I first ran for office, Ricardo, I can tell you, it wasn't an easy conversation to have with my parents. I can tell you with my mom, and they're both proud of me, very proud of me. But that first conversation with my mom, she looked at me and goes, wait a minute, you're a lawyer, you got a great career, you're making good money. Why would you put yourself out in politics like that? Why would you want people to know your business, and why would you want to make trouble? But now that I've been in it, fighting the fights that I've been doing, not just in Cranston, but across the state, or even lending my voice to some national issues, my mom, you can't get her away from the television and trying to figure out what's going on, what's happening, not just here, but across the country. So that's what I've been trying to do. And hopefully the next generation can impact their parents, their grandparents, to say, look, we have to be involved. Your voice matters. And it takes, unfortunately, situations like what's going on in our backyards right now to really elevate that conversation and break down generational barriers, even if generations have been so private that they didn't want to discuss what's going on. Because to this day, discrimination still goes on.
Well, difficult conversations is for as much as we recognize that we're in the racial reckoning that this country is dealing with, that these conversations must happen. The question becomes, how do we facilitate those conversations in a way that we're driving toward a better outcome than I've been in a lot of diversity training sessions, and I walk out saying most of the time, you had a meeting and you thought that was you dealt with the issue.
Right.
We had some diversity training, 2 sessions, an hour each. Wasn't mandatory, but but you could go. What steps can we take as a country, as a nation of immigrants, to move us to these conversations, which are essential? They cannot be avoided.
Yep.
But what do you think it comes out on the other side of the conversations? What are we looking for?
Well, there's a couple things. We need to get away from those, what I term, those check the box type meetings, because it does no good when you're sitting in a meeting and there's no follow-up. There's no action plan that comes out of it.
Right.
Fortunately, so far with what's going on in Rhode Island, we have had some productive dialogue and actually follow-up action items from all different levels. The reach out that has happened so far, whether it's from the governor's office, from our congressional delegation, both Senator Reid and White House, as well as even the U.S. Attorney's Office or the Attorney General, they had meaningful reach outs to myself, the Chinese community, other communities, other Asian communities, to proactively sit there and say, look, we're not going to tolerate it. We want to be partners, but not just in the context of just a meeting. I can recall that one meeting with the U.S. Attorney's Office where with the Chinese community, one of the things that was about to be forthcoming, because there is fear, even in Rhode Island, even though we don't have any actual acts of violence, but there is that fear that lives within the community, and the Chinese church would be opening up soon. Well, the U.S. Attorney's Office made sure that, this is one of the things that we can go out and help you proactively. We can provide a security assessment to ensure that your community is safe. By taking those initial steps, it shows that you matter. And it's not just you had a meeting for the sake of a meeting. More productive dialogue has to be followed up by proactive action within the community to show that you care. And it has to be on an ongoing basis. So it's not like, and we see this all with politicians all the time. They show up during election time, ask for your vote, then disappear. We have to make sure that we hold people accountable. Action items are put forward, but it's not just in government too, Ricardo. For too long, we've been sitting here at the table having these discussions, but yet there's a lack of diversity on our boards, not even just government boards, but private corporate boards. You know, they talk the talk, but we need to see action, not only from individuals at the top where we should have a seat at the table, but also on these boards that are key to driving decisions for many of these entities. So my wife loves to say, if they're not going to give you a seat at the table, well, bring this chair and plop it down until they have to listen to you. But most importantly, as we're having those discussions, we have to make sure that demands are attached and action items are followed up. And if they're not, we hold these individuals accountable.
I agree with everything you just said, especially the idea that, there's an old saying, which I push back against a lot these days. You can't have your cake and eat it too.
Right.
Well, that's such a ridiculous statement to me, because what good is having cake if you're not going to eat it, if you're hungry? If you're hungry and you got cake, eat it.
Yeah.
But there seems to be the idea that there's not enough to go around. If you eat your cake, that's it for you and there's no more. Well, I just reject that as an idea that if somebody's hoarding cake, I'm going to go get some of their cake. They couldn't eat it all anyway. Or even more significantly, what have we done to teach each other how to bake cake so
Right.
that everybody can eat and everybody knows the recipe?
Right.
I am as an African American, I don't ever wish anybody into our experience. It's our experience. We don't want to keep living it, but we also, it sometimes is fraught with terror and misery. Why would you invite anybody into that experience? But we are now, different groups are being terrorized, and we're going to have to find some ways of coming together, I think. But can we do it? I mean, do we have the will to do it? And I ask that not only as a lawyer and a friend, but as a political personality also.
I say we have to do it. But I'm also encouraged, and that's why I think, one of my responsibilities is to mentor and help the next generation continue on, because, the fact that, it's great that I was able to break some barriers down, be the first Asian, mayor in this state,
Right.
But it does no good if there's no one following behind us. Yeah. And that's what we have to continue to do to educate that next generation. And as much as what you've gone through, I've gone through, we all gone through, and it's difficult sometimes to relay these experiences. It has to be done, because if we don't, they're not going to understand everything that we've gone through, the difficulties and hurdles that have been thrown our way to get to the positions that we're at. But I am optimistic, and I say this because, during one of the last gubernatorial campaign, and this hit the news where, you had that one gentleman that got angry with me for whatever the policy decisions that I made, and took a noose and hung my sign upside down, tacked it on the front lawn. But I had why I say I'm optimistic is, despite all that happened, I had a very good conversation with that gentleman. And I was able to relate to him why the importance of the message he was sending was so fraught with danger, and sends a bad message to, say, a next generation of kids.
Yeah.
He never understood where I was coming from until I had that conversation. But after that conversation, I, was able to relay that. He apologized, because he never saw it from my eyes what that was going through, the experiences I've had, that many generations of African Americans have experienced with, that symbolism. But now he knows. But from that one incident, it gives me hope that we can, with continued education and the willingness to extend our hands to others and sit and maybe sometimes just break bread across the table and have that honest discussion, it does lend me hope. But we also need that continued ongoing discussion happen with the next generation too.
Well, one of the things that I'm proud of, very proud of the work we do at Mixed Magic Theater is, we say all the time that we are a place for passionate but respectful conversations, which is a lost art these days.
It is.
Passionate and respectful conversation. There's a lot of passion, but not a lot of respect.
Yes.
I also often tell my students at the colleges I've taught at, part of my job is to give you new information. But part of my job is to deny you the opportunity to say, I didn't know.
Yep.
And while researching this evening's episode, I had to deal with the fact that how much I didn't know. And just even having this conversation with you right now reminds me that I have to look further and deeper. And also the question of why it matters. The number one question on this project, the Humanities-led project, was why it matters. Well, we just had an election where everything that was important about this country mattered. Yeah. And I've said this before, I'm so proud of African Americans, because no matter what obstacles were put in our way, we found a way. Yeah. I think it might have opened the door for greater relationships with other groups who want to live a richer part of the American dream. And I'm hopeful that conversations like the one we just had will open the door for more of that conversation. It's going to be hard. Sometimes the more you know, it's like, oh my God, how do we expect to heal when there's so many wounds? But as Martin Luther King pointed out in Letter from Birmingham Jail, sometimes these wounds have festered in the dark of ignorance and tradition.
Yep.
But the healing can only happen when you take them out and expose them to the healing effects of the sun and fresh air, and maybe, just maybe, a new generation of people who says, I know the history, but I'm not going to let that interfere with our friendship.
Absolutely.
And for as much as I respect our political institutions and our religious institutions, the responsibility of the world of the arts is more important than it's ever been before. Because if we don't seize on the energy of the time and say, we don't have to stay here, we are going to stay here. Yep. Mayor, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure. We don't see each other as much as we ought to.
I know, Ricardo, but thank you so much for inviting me to this very meaningful, timely conversation, because it matters.
It matters.
It matters. And, we all have a lot to learn about, our society, because, we all live together, and we need to each engage and continue to break down barriers so that we're living harmoniously as one, because this is what our country was founded on.
Absolutely. And the future is going to depend on us staying to the greater hope of the country, not the terror of its past.
Correct.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining us tonight. Once again, I'd like to express my appreciation to Mayor Allan Fung, a good man and a good friend. And we hope that, I'm not going to put him on the spot here, but maybe one day we'll be talking about Governor Allan Fung, in the future. And we have a friend in common, Andrew Yang.
Absolutely.
Yeah, who I met at a workshop here a couple years ago. One of the most impressive men I've ever met. Honest,
yes, forthright,
smart, and has a chance to be the next mayor of New York City.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just with Andrew last week, and he's looking good right now, and I hope he can break down that barrier and be there.
Well, you know, like you say, it's not the first person that does it, it's the fifth person that does it
Yeah.
when you know you've made a change.
Absolutely.
And we've got to direct our energy toward the fifth person, I think.
That's right.
All right. Thank you very much. And thank you.
Out from the great strip city, a train came. Its cargo was pain and steel, determined to crush the will. Out from the great strip city, pain and steel rode the train. While at yesterday, clouds were rolling away and questions